Would you marry a stranger for 7 months if it meant saving the only life you had left? The question sounded absurd, almost insulting, yet Grace Bennett found herself staring at the man across the massive oak desk, unable to look away. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Walker estate, while warm light from a crystal chandelier reflected off polished marble floors. Everything in the room whispered wealth, power, and certainty. Everything except Grace. Her black housekeeping uniform was slightly faded from years of washing. Her shoes had a worn crease near the toes. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled just enough that she hoped he wouldn't notice. Ethan Walker sat across from her, calm and unreadable. At 38, he was one of the most successful businessmen in Chicago, a man whose face appeared in financial magazines and charity galas, a man who could buy almost anything he wanted. Yet at that moment, his expression held none of the confidence people expected from a billionaire. Instead, he looked tired. Not physically tired. Lonely tired. The kind that settled deep behind a person's eyes. "I don't think I heard you correctly," Grace finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You heard me correctly." Grace let out a nervous laugh. "You're asking me to pretend to be your wife. For 7 months. And you're serious." Completely. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Just an hour earlier, Grace had been cleaning guest rooms on the second floor, trying not to think about the overdue hospital bills sitting on her kitchen table at home. Then the head butler had unexpectedly informed her that Mr. Walker wanted to see her privately. She had assumed she was being fired. In truth, that possibility still seemed far more reasonable than what was happening now. "Why me?" she asked. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on hers. "Because you're the only person in this house who treats me like a human being instead of a bank account." Grace blinked. "I'm your maid." "Exactly." His answer came without hesitation. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the dark evening sky. Grace looked away. First, her thoughts immediately drifted to her mother lying in a hospital bed across town. The doctors were optimistic, but optimism didn't pay medical bills. Every week brought another statement, another balance, another reminder that time was running out. She had spent months working double shifts, skipping meals, selling personal belongings, anything to stay afloat. It still wasn't enough. Ethan opened a folder resting on his desk and slid it toward her. Grace hesitated before reaching for it. Inside sat a neatly prepared contract. The number printed near the bottom made her heart nearly stop. It was more money than she could earn in years. More money than she had ever imagined possessing. Enough to pay every bill. Enough to save her mother's treatment. Enough to start over. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. 7 months, Ethan repeated quietly. After that, we walk away. No obligations. No expectations. Just an agreement. Grace stared at the contract, then at the billionaire sitting across from her. Deep down, every instinct told her to stand up and leave. But another voice, quieter and far more desperate, reminded her she no longer had the luxury of impossible choices. For the first time in her life, the door that terrified her most might also be the only one still open. Grace barely remembered leaving Ethan's office. The rain had stopped by the time she stepped outside the estate, but the cold evening air still clung to the sidewalks. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the bus stop with the contract secured inside her bag, feeling as though the weight of it had somehow changed everything. Chicago's downtown lights shimmered across wet streets while traffic rolled past in a steady stream. Around her, life continued normally. People hurried home from work. Couples laughed outside restaurants. Taxi horns echoed through the city. Yet Grace felt disconnected from all of it. One decision stood between two completely different futures. 40 minutes later, she pushed open the door to St. Matthew Medical Center. The familiar scent of disinfectant and coffee greeted her immediately. Visiting hours were almost over. She took the elevator to the 4th floor and found her mother sitting upright in bed, reading a magazine beneath the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Rebecca Bennett smiled the moment she saw her daughter. "You look exhausted." Grace forced a smile. "Long day." Rebecca set the magazine aside. "That makes 300 long days in a row." Despite everything, Grace laughed softly. Her mother always had a way of finding humor in difficult situations. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. The weather, a television show they both liked, a nurse who kept sneaking extra pudding cups into Rebecca's room. It was comfortable, familiar, safe. Then Grace noticed a folded envelope resting beside the hospital bed. Her stomach tightened instantly. She already knew what it was. Another bill. Rebecca followed her gaze and sighed. The administrator stopped by this afternoon. Grace slowly picked up the envelope. She did not even need to open it. She knew the numbers would be worse than before. "I am sorry," Rebecca whispered. "Mom, stop. If I had gone to the doctor sooner." "Stop." Grace sat beside her and squeezed her hand. "You did nothing wrong." But later, as Rebecca drifted to sleep, Grace finally opened the envelope. Her chest tightened. The amount was more than she had feared, more than she could possibly manage. She sat alone in the quiet hospital hallway staring at the paper while nurses moved past in soft-soled shoes. For the first time in months, she stopped trying to calculate solutions. There were none left. The next morning, she returned to the Walker estate before sunrise. The mansion looked even larger beneath the pale morning sky. As she walked through the staff entrance, several employees glanced toward her. Most barely acknowledged her existence. That was normal. To many of them, Grace was simply another maid pushing a cleaning cart through endless hallways. Invisible. Replaceable. She had learned long ago not to take it personally. Halfway through her shift, the head butler approached. "Mr. Walker would like an answer today." Grace's pulse quickened immediately. The butler handed her a small silver key. His private library. 6 o'clock this evening. Grace stared at the key resting in her palm. It looked ordinary, yet something about it felt important. Significant. Like the beginning of a story she had never intended to enter. The entire day passed in a blur. By 6 o'clock, she found herself standing outside a pair of dark wooden doors on the 3rd floor. Warm golden light spilled through the gap beneath them. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Slowly, she wrapped her fingers around the silver key. Then she unlocked the door and stepped inside. Ethan looked up from the fireplace. Neither of them spoke at first. Finally, Grace took a breath and met his eyes. "I have a condition," she said quietly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Before I agree to anything, I need you to promise me one thing." For the first time since making his proposal, a faint smile appeared on his face. "What is that?" Grace swallowed hard. "Do not ask me to become someone else. If I do this, I stay me." Ethan studied her for several seconds. Then he nodded once. "That," he said softly, "is exactly why I asked you." The fire crackled softly inside the library while evening shadows stretched across shelves lined with leather-bound books. Grace remained standing even after Ethan offered her a seat. Something about the room felt different from the rest of the mansion. It was not designed to impress visitors. It felt personal, lived in, human. Ethan walked toward a small table beside the fireplace and opened a second folder. "Before you sign anything, you deserve complete honesty," he said. Grace watched carefully. Wealthy people rarely offered honesty first. "The agreement is simple. For 7 months, you will legally be my wife. You will attend public events when necessary, appear beside me when requested, and help maintain the appearance of a normal marriage." Grace folded her arms. "And after 7 months? The contract ends." Ethan answered without hesitation. "You receive the full compensation regardless of how often we appear in public." Grace studied him. Most people would hire an actress. A faint smile crossed his face. Most actresses would spend the entire time trying to become permanent. Grace almost laughed. Instead, she looked down at the contract again. The pages seemed harmless enough until she reached the section listing expectations. Public appearances, charity functions, business dinners, family obligations. A life completely different from her own. "I do not belong in those places," she admitted quietly. Ethan surprised her by shaking his head. "Neither do I." The answer lingered in the room. For the first time, Grace noticed how exhausted he looked beneath the expensive suit and perfect posture. He carried himself like a man who had spent years performing a role he no longer enjoyed. "Then why do you need this?" she asked. Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the dark estate grounds. For several seconds he said nothing. "Because every person around me wants something." His voice remained calm. "Investors want access. Partners want influence. Reporters want stories. Even people who claim to care about me usually care about what comes with my name." Grace lowered her eyes. She understood loneliness better than most people realized. "And you think I want nothing?" Ethan turned toward her. "I think you want to save your mother." The directness of the answer took her breath away. There was no judgment in his voice. No pity. Just truth. Ethan stepped closer and placed a small silver key beside the contract. "This belongs to the East Wing." Grace recognized it immediately. It matched the key she had used to enter the library. "What is in the East Wing?" she asked. "Your new residence, if you accept." Her eyes widened. "Inside the mansion? It is private, separate from my quarters." Grace stared at the key. Somehow it felt more significant than the money. The contract could solve financial problems. The key represented an entirely different life. Ethan picked up a fountain pen and placed it gently on top of the final page. "Take your time." Grace looked from the pen to the contract, then to the billionaire waiting across from her. She thought about hospital bills. She thought about overdue notices. She thought about her mother pretending not to worry. Finally, she sat down, reached for the pen, and signed her name. The moment the ink touched paper, neither of them smiled. Instead, they exchanged a quiet look filled with uncertainty. Because despite everything written inside the contract, neither one could possibly know how much their lives had just changed. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in front of a mirror she barely recognized. The woman staring back at her wore an elegant navy dress chosen by a professional stylist, her hair neatly arranged, her posture carefully corrected by an etiquette consultant hired by the estate. Yet despite every external change, she still felt like the same woman who had spent years pushing a housekeeping cart through these halls. The difference was that now the staff greeted her with forced smiles and formal titles. "Mrs. Walker." The words still sounded strange every time she heard them. Downstairs, preparations were underway for the first major public appearance of their marriage. A charity gala hosted by the Walker Foundation would introduce Grace to Chicago's business and social elite. The event itself was expected. The attention was not. Grace adjusted the bracelet on her wrist and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Ethan entered wearing a tailored black tuxedo. For a brief second, both of them seemed surprised to find themselves studying the other. Then Ethan cleared his throat and returned to business. "The car will be ready in 15 minutes. Grace nodded. "Do I look like someone who belongs at a charity gala?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "You look like someone who is about to make every guest uncomfortable." Her eyes widened. "That does not sound reassuring." "It is a compliment." Ethan walked toward the window. "Most people there spend their lives pretending. You are one of the few people I know who does not." The comment stayed with her long after they left the room. 40 minutes later, the black sedan rolled beneath the bright lights of the Grand Lakeshore Hotel. Cameras flashed immediately. Grace instinctively froze. Reporters crowded behind velvet barriers, while photographers shouted questions neither of them answered. Ethan quietly offered his arm. Not as a husband, not even as a friend. More like someone recognizing another person's fear. Grace accepted. Together they stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers illuminated a ballroom filled with hundreds of guests. Conversations paused as heads turned. Some faces smiled politely. Others looked openly curious. Grace could almost hear the questions forming. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had Ethan Walker married a former maid? Throughout the evening, she did her best to follow every lesson she had learned. Smile. Listen. Remain calm. Avoid controversial conversations. Everything went smoothly until dinner. During a discussion about community outreach programs, several executives casually dismissed a proposal supporting working families struggling with medical expenses. The comments were not cruel. They were worse. They were indifferent. Grace listened quietly at first. Then she thought about hospital corridors. She thought about overdue bills. She thought about her mother. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. The table fell silent. For nearly 3 minutes, Grace explained what financial hardship actually looked like from the inside. Not statistics. Not reports. Real life. Real people. When she finished, no one immediately responded. The silence felt endless. Finally, one elderly donor slowly nodded. Then another. Soon the conversation shifted completely. New ideas emerged. Additional funding was pledged. Across the table, Ethan said nothing. Yet for the rest of the evening, he never once took his eyes off her. Because somewhere between the cameras, the formal introductions, and the expensive ballroom, Grace had done something no consultant could teach and no contract could require. She had reminded an entire room of powerful people what compassion actually looked like. The days following the gala brought a change no one inside the Walker estate could quite explain. It began with small things. The kitchen staff laughed more often. Fresh flowers started appearing in rooms that had remained untouched for years. Even the atmosphere seemed lighter, as though the mansion itself had finally remembered it was meant to be lived in rather than displayed. Grace never intended to influence anyone. She simply continued being herself. Every morning she greeted employees by name. She remembered birthdays. She asked about sick relatives. She thanked people whose work usually went unnoticed. Simple gestures, ordinary kindness. Yet in a house where hierarchy had always mattered, those gestures stood out. One afternoon, Grace carried a tray of tea through the west corridor when she noticed an elderly groundskeeper struggling to carry several heavy boxes toward a storage room. Without hesitation, she set down the tray and offered help. The man looked surprised. "Mrs. Walker, you do not have to do that." Grace smiled. "Neither do you." Together, they carried the boxes the rest of the way. Unfortunately, they were not alone. Several staff members witnessed the interaction. By dinner, the story had traveled through the estate. Not because she had done anything extraordinary, but because nobody could remember the last time a member of the Walker family had stopped to help an employee. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in the library reviewing financial reports when his longtime house manager, Margaret, knocked on the door. "You have a moment?" she asked. Ethan looked up. Of course. Margaret entered carrying a folder, but never opened it. Instead, she studied him carefully. "The staff wanted me to tell you something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." A rare smile appeared on the older woman's face. "They wanted me to thank you." "For what?" "For bringing her here." Ethan leaned back in his chair. The answer caught him off guard. Margaret continued. "People work harder when they feel seen. They care more when someone cares about them." Ethan glanced toward the fireplace. "She is good with people." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "She is good with hearts." After she left, Ethan found himself unable to focus on the reports in front of him. Instead, he thought about Grace, about the way she spoke to strangers, about how naturally people trusted her, about the gala, about the hospital visits she still made every week despite her new circumstances. Over the next several days, he began noticing details he had somehow missed before. She always carried snacks in her purse, because she worried someone else might need them. She stopped to pet every dog she passed on the estate grounds. She never spoke badly about anyone, even when given a reason. The realization unsettled him more than he expected, because somewhere along the way, Grace had become more than a contract, more than a temporary arrangement, more than the solution to a problem. And for the first time since signing the agreement, Ethan found himself looking forward to moments he could not explain. A conversation over breakfast, a shared joke in the hallway, the sound of her laughter drifting from another room. Small moments, harmless moments. Yet as he stood by the library window watching her cross the garden below beneath the glow of golden evening light, one uncomfortable truth slowly settled into his mind. The woman he had hired to play a role was quietly becoming the most important person in his world. By the beginning of the 4th month, Ethan had developed a habit he refused to acknowledge. Every morning before leaving for the office, he found himself looking for Grace. Sometimes she was in the kitchen talking with the staff over coffee. Sometimes she was walking through the gardens with a notebook in her hand. Sometimes she was on the phone with her mother, smiling in a way that made the entire room feel warmer. He always told himself it was coincidence. It was not. One Saturday afternoon, a rare free day appeared on his calendar after a last-minute cancellation. Ethan intended to spend the afternoon reviewing reports in his study. Instead, he wandered through the estate until he heard music coming from the old sunroom overlooking the gardens. Curious, he stepped quietly toward the doorway. Grace was alone. She had not noticed him. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows while she arranged flowers into simple glass vases for the dining room. A small speaker played soft music nearby. She moved without urgency, humming along to the melody, completely unaware that anyone was watching. There was nothing remarkable about the scene. No grand gesture. No dramatic moment. Yet Ethan found himself standing there longer than he intended. For years his life had been filled with boardrooms, negotiations, and endless schedules. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a cost. But Grace seemed capable of finding joy in ordinary moments most people ignored. Eventually a vase slipped slightly from her hands. Ethan instinctively stepped forward. "Careful." Grace startled and turned around. "How long have you been standing there?" A guilty smile appeared on his face. Long enough to know you are better with flowers than financial reports. She laughed. That is not exactly a difficult achievement. The sound of her laughter lingered after the conversation ended. Later that evening, Ethan attended a business dinner downtown. The restaurant was crowded with investors and executives discussing expansion plans. Normally, he thrived in those environments. This time he felt distracted. Halfway through the meal, someone asked a question about a future acquisition. Ethan realized he had not heard a single word spoken during the previous 5 minutes. His thoughts had drifted elsewhere, specifically to a woman arranging flowers in a sunlit room. The realization unsettled him. When he finally returned to the estate after 10 o'clock, most of the lights had been turned off. As he passed the east wing, he noticed a faint glow beneath a doorway. Curious, he knocked lightly. Grace opened the door wearing comfortable clothes and holding a thick novel. "You are still awake?" she asked. "Apparently so are you." She smiled and stepped aside. The room felt cozy and personal now. Books sat stacked beside the sofa. Family photographs rested on shelves. A knitted blanket covered one chair. It no longer looked like temporary housing. It looked like a home. For several minutes they talked about nothing important. Books, movies, childhood memories, ordinary subjects. Yet Ethan could not remember the last time a conversation had felt so effortless. When he finally stood to leave, neither seemed eager for the evening to end. As he walked back toward his own wing of the mansion, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. Somewhere between the contract, the gala, and countless ordinary moments, he had crossed a line he never intended to cross. Ethan Walker was falling in love with his wife. The problem was that she was never supposed to become his real one. The 5th month arrived quietly, bringing colder mornings and longer evenings to the Walker estate. Life had settled into a rhythm neither Ethan nor Grace had expected. They shared breakfasts more often than necessary. They lingered in conversations longer than either intended. And although neither spoke about the approaching end of their agreement, both felt the date drawing closer with every passing week. One rainy afternoon, Grace found herself searching for holiday decorations in a rarely used storage area beneath the oldest section of the mansion. Margaret had mentioned several unopened boxes stored there years ago. Armed with a flashlight, Grace descended a narrow staircase leading to the lower level. Dust floated through beams of light filtering from small basement windows. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with forgotten objects collected over decades. Family portraits, antique clocks, leather trunks. The history of the Walker family seemed frozen in time around her. As Grace moved several boxes aside, something unusual caught her attention. Tucked behind an old wooden cabinet sat a small metal lockbox covered in dust. It looked different from everything else in the room. Not valuable, not decorative, important. Curiosity got the better of her. She carefully lifted it onto a nearby table. Attached to the handle was a yellowed tag written in fading ink. Property of Charles Walker. Do not discard. Grace recognized the name immediately. Charles Walker had been Ethan's father, the legendary businessman who built the family's fortune decades earlier. She gently brushed away the dust. The lockbox was not locked. Inside sat several old documents, a faded photograph, and a sealed envelope. The envelope immediately drew her attention. Unlike the other papers, it appeared untouched. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 6 words that made her heart skip. To be delivered when found. Grace stared at the message. Beneath it was a date from nearly 20 years earlier. She hesitated. Opening someone else's letter felt wrong. Yet the instructions suggested it had never reached its intended destination. Before she could decide what to do, footsteps echoed from the staircase behind her. Ethan appeared carrying a second flashlight. "Margaret said you disappeared into the basement." Grace turned toward him, still holding the envelope. "I think I found something." His expression shifted the moment he saw the box. Slowly he walked closer. "I have not seen that since I was a teenager." Together they examined its contents. Ethan picked up the photograph first. It showed his father standing beside several unfamiliar people outside what appeared to be a small community center. Then Grace handed him the envelope. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Ethan studied the handwriting for several seconds. "That is definitely my father's writing." Grace swallowed. "Should we open it?" For a moment he seemed uncertain. Then he nodded. Carefully, he broke the old seal and unfolded the letter inside. His eyes moved across the page. Once, then again. The color slowly drained from his face. Grace immediately noticed. Ethan. He looked up at her with an expression she had never seen before. Shock. Genuine shock. Then, without saying a word, he turned the paper toward her. Near the center of the letter, written clearly among the faded lines, was a name. Her name. Grace Bennett. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The basement seemed to fall into complete silence except for the faint hum of the old ventilation system. Grace stared at the letter, convinced she had misunderstood what she was seeing. Her name appeared clearly on the page. Not a similar name. Not another Bennett. Her exact name. Ethan carefully took the letter back and continued reading. The document was dated 19 years earlier. It described a community outreach project Charles Walker had quietly funded in a struggling Chicago neighborhood. As Ethan read each line aloud, pieces of a forgotten story slowly emerged. A local family had apparently helped Charles during a difficult period shortly after a serious business setback. The family never asked for recognition. They never accepted money. According to the letter, Charles had spent years trying to repay that kindness. Then Grace heard another name. Her mother's. Rebecca Bennett. Her heart immediately began racing. That is impossible, she whispered. Ethan looked equally stunned. You have never heard my father mention your family? Grace shook her head. I never even met your father. They spent the next hour examining every document inside the box. Most appeared to be records connected to charitable projects Charles had managed privately. But the letter remained the most important discovery. Near the end, Charles wrote about establishing a special trust intended to benefit the Bennett family someday, if they could be located. Unfortunately, there was no indication the letter had ever been delivered. The box had simply disappeared into storage and been forgotten for nearly 2 decades. By the time they returned upstairs, both were emotionally exhausted. Yet neither could stop thinking about what they had discovered. The following morning, Ethan contacted the family's legal advisors and instructed them to investigate every detail. He expected answers within days. Unfortunately, life rarely waited for convenient timing. That same afternoon, another unexpected complication arrived at the estate. Her name was Victoria Langford. Grace recognized her immediately from magazine photographs. Tall, elegant, and effortlessly confident, Victoria had once been engaged to Ethan several years earlier. Their relationship had ended long before Grace entered the picture, but the moment Victoria stepped into the mansion, the atmosphere changed. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. Conversations became quieter. Even Ethan seemed uncomfortable. Victoria offered Grace a polite smile that somehow felt colder than open hostility. I have heard so much about you, she said. Grace returned the smile. Nice to meet you. Likewise. Victoria's eyes briefly moved toward Ethan before returning to Grace. Although I admit I was surprised. Grace understood exactly what she meant. Surprised that Ethan had married a former maid. Surprised that someone like Grace had somehow entered a world reserved for people like Victoria. During dinner, Victoria remained charming and sophisticated. Yet every compliment seemed carefully designed to remind Grace that she did not belong. Ethan noticed it too. More than once he redirected conversations away from uncomfortable territory. The evening ended politely, but tension lingered long afterward. Later that night, Grace stood alone beside her bedroom window looking out across the estate grounds. In one hand, she held a photocopy of Charles Walker's letter. In the other, she held the small silver key Ethan had given her months earlier. One mystery had just begun unfolding. Another had unexpectedly walked through the front door. And somewhere deep inside, Grace sensed that both were about to change everything. The scandal began on a Tuesday morning. Grace discovered it the same way everyone else did. Through a headline. She was sitting in the estate kitchen drinking coffee when one of the younger staff members accidentally dropped a tablet onto the table. The screen displayed a photo taken outside the charity gala months earlier. Ethan stood beside her, offering his arm as cameras flashed around them. Beneath the image was a headline that instantly made her stomach tighten. Billionaire's marriage was secret business arrangement. Grace felt the color drain from her face. More articles appeared within hours. Anonymous sources claimed the marriage had been staged. Commentators debated whether she had manipulated Ethan. Social media filled with speculation from people who knew nothing about either of them. By noon, reporters had gathered outside the estate gates. Television vans lined the street. Every network seemed eager to discuss a story they barely understood. Grace spent most of the day avoiding the news. Unfortunately, the news did not avoid her. Her phone filled with messages from former coworkers, distant relatives, and complete strangers. Some were supportive, others were not. For the first time since arriving at the estate, she felt like an outsider again. That evening she visited her mother at the hospital. Rebecca immediately noticed something was wrong. "You look like you have not slept in days," she said softly. Grace forced a smile that fooled neither of them. Eventually she explained everything. The articles, the rumors, the accusations. Rebecca listened quietly before reaching across the bed and squeezing her daughter's hand. People can only judge the part of the story they see. Grace lowered her eyes. What if they are right? About what? Maybe I never belonged in that world. Rebecca laughed gently. Grace, you belonged there long before anyone gave you permission. The question is whether they deserve you. The words stayed with her during the drive back to the estate. Yet the situation continued to worsen. The next morning, several board members demanded explanations from Ethan. Investors questioned his judgment. Reporters dug into Grace's past, searching for anything that might attract attention. What hurt most was not the criticism. It was the suspicion, the assumption that kindness had to be calculated, that every relationship required a hidden motive. Late that night, Grace stood alone in the library staring at the fireplace. The contract remained locked inside a drawer nearby. Only 2 months remained before the agreement expired. Suddenly, the future seemed painfully simple. When the 7 months ended, the scandal would disappear. Ethan's reputation would recover. Everyone could move on. She heard footsteps behind her. Ethan entered carrying several folders before immediately noticing her expression. You have been reading the articles. It was not a question. Grace nodded. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she looked at him and forced herself to say the words she had been avoiding all day. Maybe this would be easier if I left now. Ethan's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Not frustration. Something deeper. Something far more personal. For the first time since the scandal began, Grace realized that the thought of losing her frightened him just as much as the thought frightened her. The words hung in the air between them. Maybe this would be easier if I left now. Grace immediately wished she could take them back, yet part of her believed them. The scandal had grown larger than either of them expected. Every day brought another article, another rumor, another reminder that their lives had become public entertainment. Ethan set the folders on a nearby table and walked closer. Do not say that. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind it. Grace looked away. You saw the headlines. Investors are questioning you. The board is questioning you. Everyone thinks I am the problem. They are wrong. That does not change what they believe. Silence settled over the library. The fire crackled softly while rain tapped against the windows. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Do you know what happened at today's board meeting? Grace shook her head. 3 directors suggested I distance myself from you. Her heart sank. Ethan continued. One suggested ending the agreement early. Grace closed her eyes. Hearing the words spoken aloud hurt more than she expected. And, she asked quietly. And I refused. She looked up. Ethan's expression never changed. Without hesitation. For a moment neither moved. Then a knock interrupted them. Margaret stepped inside carrying a thick envelope. This arrived from the legal team, she said. Ethan immediately recognized the firm's name. The investigation into his father's letter. He thanked Margaret and opened the package. Grace watched as he removed several documents. The deeper he read, the more serious his expression became. Finally, he lowered the papers and looked directly at her. We found the missing records. Grace's pulse quickened. What records? Ethan handed her the top page. The document contained bank records, legal filings, and correspondence connected to Charles Walker's trust. According to the investigation, the trust had been created exactly as the letter described. More importantly, the intended beneficiary was clearly identified. Grace Bennett. She stared at the page in disbelief. This cannot be real. It is. Ethan sat down slowly. My father established the trust after your family helped him during one of the worst periods of his life. Grace struggled to process the information. But why was it never delivered? Ethan turned another page. Because the attorney responsible for locating your family retired unexpectedly. The file was misplaced during a transition. After that, everyone assumed the matter had already been resolved. 20 years. The number echoed in Grace's mind. 20 years of a forgotten promise hidden inside a basement storage box. Then she reached the final page. Her eyes widened. The value of the trust was enormous. Life-changing. Far beyond anything she had imagined. Grace immediately placed the document back on the table. I cannot accept this. Ethan almost smiled. That was my exact reaction when I imagined what you would say. I am serious. So am I. For several seconds, they simply stared at one another. Then Ethan said something unexpected. The money is not what matters most. Grace frowned. Then what does? He looked at the letter resting beside the fireplace. The fact that my father spent years trying to find your family. The fact that fate somehow brought you here anyway. Neither of them noticed that outside the library door, someone had quietly paused during the conversation. Victoria stood motionless in the hallway, her eyes fixed on the slightly open doorway. And after hearing just enough to understand part of the truth, she quietly turned and walked away with a plan already forming in her mind. The next 48 hours changed everything. News of the trust should have remained confidential while attorneys completed their review, but somehow details began appearing online. At first the reports were vague. Then they became specific. Commentators who had spent months accusing Grace of chasing wealth suddenly presented her as the rightful beneficiary of a forgotten fortune. The public reaction shifted overnight. Some called it destiny. Others called it suspicious. Grace called it exhausting. She spent most of her time avoiding cameras and refusing interview requests. None of it felt real. One afternoon she sat with her mother in a quiet hospital garden while autumn leaves drifted across the pathways. Rebecca listened carefully as Grace explained everything that had happened. The letter, the trust, the investigation. When she finished, her mother smiled softly. Your grandfather would have laughed. Grace looked surprised. Why? Because he always said kindness leaves footprints even when you cannot see them. The words stayed with her long after she returned to the estate. Meanwhile, Ethan faced a different challenge. The board wanted answers. Investors wanted stability. Reporters wanted drama. Yet none of those concerns occupied his thoughts the way Grace did. Every time he imagined the contract ending, an uncomfortable emptiness settled over him. For months he had convinced himself there would be time to sort through his feelings later. Now later was arriving far too quickly. Then the situation exploded again. During a major press conference intended to address recent rumors, Victoria unexpectedly stepped forward and made a statement that stunned everyone in attendance. Speaking calmly and confidently, she suggested that Grace had known about the trust all along. She implied that the marriage, the timing, and the discovery of the letter were somehow connected. The accusation spread across media platforms within minutes. Grace watched the broadcast from the library and felt physically ill. Not because she feared the claim was true, because she knew exactly how convincing it sounded. Ethan immediately ended the conference and returned to the estate. When he entered the library, he found Grace standing beside the fireplace holding the photocopy of Charles Walker's letter. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Grace handed him the paper. Maybe this is why people think I do not belong here. Ethan looked at her. Do not say that. Look at everything that has happened. The contract, the trust, the headlines. If I were watching this story from the outside, I would probably believe it too. Ethan stepped closer. I would not. Grace shook her head. You are biased. For the first time in months, Ethan stopped calculating consequences. He stopped worrying about appearances. He stopped thinking like a businessman. Instead, he spoke the truth. Yes, he said quietly. I am. Grace looked up. Ethan held her gaze without hesitation. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about a contract. The room fell silent. Outside, evening light painted the windows gold. Neither of them moved. Neither looked away. And for the first time, since their unusual arrangement began, the truth standing between them was no longer the trust, the scandal, or the forgotten letter. It was the fact that their hearts had already made a choice long before either of them was ready to admit it. The final month arrived faster than either of them expected. Every calendar reminder felt heavier. Every shared meal carried an unspoken awareness that time was running out. The contract that had once seemed so important now sat untouched inside a drawer in Ethan's desk. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither wanted to. Yet its expiration date lingered quietly in the background of every conversation. A week after the press conference, the legal investigation reached its conclusion. Independent records confirmed every detail contained in Charles Walker's letter. The trust was legitimate. The timeline was accurate. Most importantly, there was no evidence that Grace had known anything about it before discovering the letter in the basement. The official report cleared her completely. News outlets quickly corrected their earlier assumptions. Public opinion shifted once again. But for Grace, the victory felt strangely hollow. She had spent months fighting to prove she was not interested in money. Now the world suddenly celebrated her because she possessed it. One afternoon, she sat alone in the hospital garden beside her mother. Rebecca's health had improved significantly, and for the first time in years there was genuine optimism in her future. Grace should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt lost. "You are thinking too much again," Rebecca said with a smile. Grace laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who love you." For several moments they watched children play near a fountain. Then Grace finally asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. "What if everything changes?" Rebecca turned toward her. "Everything always changes." "That is not what I mean." Her mother nodded gently. "You are afraid the trust changed how people see you." Grace lowered her eyes. Rebecca squeezed her hand. "The right people saw you long before any of this happened." That evening, Grace returned to the estate and made a decision. The next morning, she met with the attorneys overseeing the trust. To their complete surprise, she declined personal ownership of most of the fortune. Instead, she directed the majority of the funds toward community health programs, educational scholarships, and support services for working families facing medical hardship. Programs inspired by everything her own family had experienced. The announcement spread quickly. Reporters expected headlines about inheritance. Instead, they found a story about generosity. By the end of the day, even some of her harshest critics struggled to find fault. When Ethan learned what she had done, he immediately left a board meeting and drove back to the estate. He found Grace sitting beneath an old oak tree near the garden path. Autumn leaves drifted around her, while the late afternoon sun painted the grounds gold. Ethan approached slowly. "You gave most of it away." Grace smiled faintly. "Not away. Forward." He sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Grace took a deep breath. "The contract ends next week." Ethan looked down at the grass. The words hurt more than he expected. "I know. When this started, I thought 7 months would feel long." Her voice softened. "Now it feels like 7 days." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every instinct told him to say what was in his heart. Yet before he could speak, Grace stood. Tears shimmered in her eyes, though her smile remained gentle. "I need to know something, Ethan." He rose to face her. "What?" Grace held his gaze. "When all of this is over, when there is no contract, no trust, no headlines, would you still have chosen me?" With that question hanging between them, she quietly turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing beneath the falling leaves with an answer he could no longer keep to himself. For the next 3 days, Ethan carried Grace's question with him everywhere. During meetings, he heard it. While reviewing contracts, he heard it. Late at night, standing alone in the library where everything had begun, he heard it again. "Would you still have chosen me?" The answer had never been complicated. He had simply been too afraid to say it. On the morning the agreement officially expired, the Walker estate felt strangely quiet. The staff moved through the halls with unusual anticipation, as though everyone sensed an important chapter was ending. Grace spent the day packing the few personal belongings she had brought into the East Wing months earlier. Books, photographs, small keepsakes collected during her time there. She paused when she reached the silver key Ethan had given her on the night she signed the contract. For a long moment, she stared at it resting in her palm. It no longer felt like a key to a room. It felt like a key to an entirely different life. By late afternoon, she carried her final box downstairs. Margaret met her in the foyer and smiled softly. "Before you leave, there is somewhere Mr. Walker asked you to go." Grace frowned. "Where?" "The library." Her heart immediately began racing. The same library. The same room where everything had started 7 months earlier. Slowly she walked through the familiar doors. Warm golden light filled the room. The fireplace glowed softly. Ethan stood beside the desk waiting for her. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Grace noticed something unusual resting on the desk between them. The contract. Ethan looked at her quietly. "Do you remember the first thing you asked me?" Grace smiled faintly. "Which time?" A small laugh escaped him. Then his expression turned serious again. You asked me not to make you become someone else. Grace nodded. Ethan reached for the contract. You never did. Without another word, he opened the document. Then, slowly and deliberately, he tore it in half. Grace froze. Ethan continued until every page had been reduced to pieces. The agreement that had controlled their lives for 7 months disappeared into the fireplace one section at a time. Neither looked away. When the final page vanished into the flames, Ethan picked up a small wooden box. Inside rested the silver key, the same key that had once opened the East Wing. My father spent years trying to find your family, he said quietly. Fate brought you here anyway. His voice softened. But if I am being completely honest, the greatest thing he ever gave me was not the trust. It was the chance to meet you. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. Ethan stepped closer. When all of this is over, when there is no contract, no trust, no headlines, would I still choose you? He smiled. Grace, I would choose you in every version of this story. Then he held out the key. Not to the East Wing. Grace looked at him in confusion. Ethan's eyes never left hers. To our home, if you want it. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace laughed through her tears and wrapped her arms around him. The answer required no speech. Outside, evening sunlight poured through the library windows while autumn leaves drifted across the estate grounds. The contract had ended exactly as promised. But the real marriage, the one neither of them expected when this journey began, was only just beginning.